So good morning to all. Thank you very much for having joined us. My name is Barbara Mainzer, and I'm a member of the board of directors of CFA Society Uruguay. And today we are having a webinar on a very important topic, both for the world and for the future of finance, ESG factors. Amongst the highest risks, both in terms of probability and likelihood, are risks associated with environmental factors. These factors, ESG factors, all of them have become mainstream, also in finance. Consideration of ESG factors is becoming an integral part of investment management. It is not only necessary and demanded by society, but studies showed that integrating ESG factors derives in better risk-adjusted returns. Furthermore, the incorporation of sustainability in investment management is an important element in the industry's mission to serve society by improving long-term outcomes. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Rebecca Fender, our speaker today. Rebecca is the head of Future Finance, the division of CFA Institute that develops the Institute's thought leadership to help shape a more trustworthy, forward-thinking investment profession that better serves society. Future of Finance does flagship reports analyzing some of the most important and pressing topics in finance, and its latest report is exactly on ESG. Rebecca will do a very short presentation followed by questions. So without further comment, Rebecca, thank you so much for having joined us. It's all yours.
Thanks, Barbara. It is really a pleasure to be here with you. And Barbara has been a volunteer with the Future Finance for a while, so I know she's been bringing you many of the messages that we have developed. And here I will give you some of the highlights of our latest work. So as we think about the topic of sustainable investing, we really think it is critical to the sustainability of investing, that it is essential for the investment industry to understand how to integrate ESG factors into the way we do analysis going forward. So let me mention 3 ways that sustainable investing goes further than traditional investing. So first, it is additive to investment theory. It does not mean a rejection of foundational concepts, but again, it means more. Secondly, it develops deeper insights about how value will be created going forward using ESG tools. So we can think of sustainability as the concept and ESG as the tools to implement. And lastly, it considers many stakeholders. So you may hear of stakeholder capitalism, where we consider the impacts of all investment decisions. So here, as you'll see by our title, we're suggesting that there have been a lot of great ideas about how to do this in the past, but now we're at a place where we can really bring this into reality. So Barbara mentioned that this is part of a series. I won't give too much detail on this, but just to note that we see there are interactions between some of the key trends across the industry, like fintech. Parallel worlds is how we think about the different segments of people across society and how they interact with finance. So again, here we see that customization is a great desire for individual investors, and sustainability is in the middle of that conversation. Lower for longer, of course, we look at what are the ways that people can achieve their return objectives, even in historically low return environments or rate environments. So again, it puts a bit more pressure on the business model of investment management and requires innovation. And lastly, purposeful capitalism. We've talked about this for many years, but here we see how sustainability, ethics, and other alignment with client interests is coming to the center. So we think about this in terms of the big trends for the industry, the implications for the firms, and you can see the parts of the firm across the middle of this slide. And then we think also about what does it mean for the individual that works in the industry. In particular, there are new skills to be developed in this area. So as we think about applications of these scenarios, the 2 in particular we would note that are moving quickly are around climate, of course, as we had, the climate, the Paris Agreement, and now COP26 will be the next one where people will report on how they are moving toward those goals. We see that there is a need for more things like carbon pricing and better climate risk management. This will be a differentiator for investment firms. And then the other one we call social status, somewhat lightheartedly, to just say it is the S in ESG that has never been very well defined, but a lot of work is now going into that as we think about things from diversity and inclusion to supply chain to other factors that may relate again to employee well-being in the context of the pandemic. So let me speak just briefly about the methodology. We had a very wide range of views into this report. More than 7,000 people contributed in some way. So about 4,400 clients of the investment industry, whether individuals or organizations like pension funds and so forth. We also surveyed CFA Institute members, about 2,800 from around the world, including CEOs and others that are leading firms and ESG specialists. Lastly, we did roundtables in 23 different roundtables with people from 31 different markets represented. So it's a much more comprehensive study than many others. We've leveraged our network to do that. And again, while we would have normally done these in person, we did these virtually. And so with no impact on the carbon footprint, we've gotten a lot of input. So with that, I'll give you the basic structure of the report. So we use this acronym of IDEA and go through these different areas. So influences is really about how we got to where we are in this topic. So we'll look at that journey and then the trends going forward. Some of the data that show that there is a big change and acceleration in this area. In drivers, we look at specifically the business models and the investment models of investment firms and how they will need to adapt. For enablers, we look at the operating model and the people model of investment organizations. So you can think of this as the data and the talent aspects that are needed for success. And lastly, actions. So we offer some self-assessments and a basic framework for organizations and individuals to think about next steps for development. So first on the influences, I would just note that for anyone who may be very new to this subject, just this part of the paper can be a helpful primer to understand the history and the influences again into this topic. So we can summarize the timeline into 3 phases. And again, there you see the acceleration. So the first phase was about 35 years long. It was really the first funds were developing, mostly with a socially responsible label, where they would exclude different types of investments that were not aligned with values and so forth. Then in the second phase, this began with the establishment of the UN PRI, which specifically changed the focus to ESG integration, as we talk about the ways that you look at both the risks and the opportunities in the analysis of specific companies. Part of this phase, of course, also was the Paris Agreement that began deeper conversations around climate. And then we would suggest that the next phase has really just begun during the year 2020, as we've had, of course, global events that give us greater recognition into the interconnectedness of the global landscape and of finance, as well as the environment and social aspects. So a few figures to tell you what we're seeing in terms of this movement. As we surveyed our members, we've done this for a number of years to ask, are you considering E, S, and or G factors in your analysis? And now 85% of our survey respondents say they do, and that's up from 73% just a few years ago. So a big jump there. It had been we asked in 2015 as well, it was stable from 2015 to 2017. So it is really a big jump now. Also, of these different factors, you can see that environmental is the area that has grown the most in that time. So when we consider the motivations for investors and specifically investment professionals to consider these issues, the number one reason is to help manage investment risks. But the second reason is because clients and investors are increasingly demanding this. It's in the Americas region where we've seen the biggest jump here. About 2/3 of investment professionals say their clients are demanding these types of products, and it was less than half just a few years ago. Moving on to the drivers, this section, as I said, mentions how investment organizations can adapt their business models and their investment models. So here we look at the business opportunity, and our survey of investors, the end client, found that about 70% of retail investors have interest in ESG, and that's nearly as high as the interest among institutional investors. However, when asked, do you currently employ these strategies, only 19% of institutional investors and 10% of retail investors use these. So there's a huge gap in the interest and the actual implementation, and this represents a big opportunity for the investment industry. You'll see here that in every market we surveyed, a majority of investors have interest in ESG investing, and it's growing. We also have found that across all ages, a majority of investors have interest. And that is different from a few years ago when I think many will talk about how it's younger investors that have the most interest. That's still true, but even now across the full age spectrum, we see a majority have interest. It may also be worth noting that we think there are opportunities to develop new products, including different thematic products, and really expanding some of these ESG themes across asset classes. Along with this, we expect there to be development of new benchmarks to support this. Just with such high interest levels, the question remained, what would convince people to actually do this type of investing? So we asked a little bit more of this investor group. And so we asked, what describes your interest in ESG investing? And the options were either an expectation for higher risk-adjusted returns, you see that in green, or a desire to express your personal values, or the expectation of both. So you'll see that on the institutional side, it is mostly the expectation for higher risk-adjusted returns. For individuals, it is mostly wanting to align with values. But you'll also note that these bars at the bottom are by age group. And so you'll see the younger the investor, the more likely they are to expect these interests to be aligned, so that investing in ESG also means better returns. So that leads us to think about, what do we really mean when we say ESG investing? And it can mean many things in terms of the approach. So again, we've asked our members over the years which approach they tend to take. ESG integration has really been the leader for most of this time, but you'll also see large increases in the other approaches, and particularly now in best-in-class screening, positive screening. So again, increased approaches, and these aren't mutually exclusive, so some portfolios can have more than one. I also wanted to note that these represent 5 of the 6 areas that are covered in the forthcoming standard by CFA Institute around disclosure. So we are working on an investment product disclosure standard for investment firms to use to describe the types of ESG approaches they're using. So the one that's not listed here is impact investing. So you can consider these approaches, and we'll be asking that investment firms try to share a little bit more about their approach with their clients in the documentation they provide. Now, moving on to the enablers, here again, we look at the people and the data. So let's start with data. because I think it's often the first thing that our members will discuss when it comes to sustainability. A bit of frustration sometimes that there's not the right kind of data, the quality can be challenging. But what we know is that this is an area where progress will be made and it's important to pursue it. So you can see on the left side here, without good data, we face the risk of greenwashing. So nearly 80% of our members said there is a need for standards that communicate clearly to clients. And so again, that's part of the reason we are developing this standard, which should be available for consultation next month and then finalized by November. This is the same group that's worked on the Global Investment Performance Standards, or the GIP standards, for many years. We also know, you can see on the right side, that ESG ratings have been an important data source, and they are used widely by about 2/3 of analysts and portfolio managers. In addition, more than 70% of our members expect that the influence of ESG ratings on the firm's cost of capital will be greater in the future. So again, these activities will translate to changes in valuation. So we also know that there is the rise of alternative data, and ESG success, we think, will hinge heavily on how well an organization's technology adapts to new types of data. So among our roundtable participants, more than 70% said the rise of alternative data will make sustainability analysis more robust. Also, more than 40% said that artificial intelligence has a role to play. So there's a lot more to come in this space. Now, a growing area for data is in climate. And for those interested in a deeper dive on climate risk analysis, we have another paper written by my colleague that talks about case studies where different firms in the industry are taking innovative approaches to this. But currently, only 40% of investment professionals incorporate climate risk into their analysis. And the primary reason, again, is that these are material factors. Of course, good data doesn't mean much unless you have the right people to analyze it. And so for that, firms need people with sustainability expertise. Now, we looked at LinkedIn Talent Insights and analyzed more than 1 million profiles with these different job titles to understand what is the supply of sustainability skills in the marketplace. And you can see it's very low. Less than 1% of these investment professionals claim they have sustainability skills. So that represents about 8,000 people here. However, you can see that it's growing. And in the last column, you can see that demand is also very high. So again, 18% of portfolio manager job postings are asking for this skill. So again, we looked at about 10,000 job postings just in 1 month to get this snapshot of what that demand looks like. Now, the structure of teams at investment firms is another area for some change that we think is coming. But as we ask now, about 1/3 of firms have dedicated ESG specialists. About 1/3 have portfolio managers, more general portfolio managers that do ESG analysis. And about 1/3 do not have specialists. Now, part of this relates to training, and we find that only 11% of our members say they are already proficient in this area. Another 11% are currently getting trained, and then about 70% are expecting to pursue training in the next year or thereafter. So there's a lot of knowledge building that will be coming in the industry in this area, and there are many tools we have to help you if this is of interest. So that takes us to the action section. And as we think about what are the things that individuals can do and organizations can do, again, we're looking out at a longer time period. And so we have a relatively high bar to suggest people need to take some action to move, to progress. So we talk about a rubric for progress, and we take that term rubric from the educational space. which is typically a scoring guide for students to help provide feedback on ways to improve. So we have online a self-assessment that you can take. I'll give you the link. And in each of these 6 areas, there's just 3 questions you can answer to get a sense of sort of where you stand currently. But at this point, what I can do is I can tell you just a couple things about how we see this at an industry level, and then we can go on to other areas. So as we group these, we can think of the first 2 items in blue as changes to investment thinking. In the middle, we can think about changes to technology and ways of working. And in the right column, we think about how teamwork plays a factor. So on ESG education, the first item, we find that ESG knowledge and practical know-how is relatively uneven across the industry. Again, with only 11% saying they are proficient, there is a lot of change coming. In the second item, in system level thinking, this is an area that challenges many, but it's really about thinking about how the whole system is connected. It means when you make an investment decision, do you think about the ripple effects? What is not just the first impact, but what happens afterwards and the next step after that? So areas that are really systemic, like climate, that's an area where you can think about this a lot more. And again, as we look at some of the social issues more broadly. With collaboration synergy, number 3, we know that at an industry level, there has been a lot of fragmentation around this topic of ESG, although many groups are now coming together to work together. We also see that at individual investment firms, different groups tend to be siloed. And so there's opportunity for knowledge sharing across organizations or within organizations. And then ESG data we spoke about already. And we would argue that this is an area that has been really the source of concern or problems, but we're at a point where it will become part of the solution. In number 5, sustainability innovation, we think that the industry has been relatively slow and narrow in the innovation so far, but again, there are many opportunities for the future. And lastly, purposeful culture is around some of the thinking around how does using sustainability, how does integrating that in both help the organization and help the clients and their outcomes. So it's that sort of enlightened self-interest that we consider there that helps firms figure out how to use sustainability and also provides more purpose and a greater connection to the reason that we have finance for society anyway. Briefly, I just wanted to talk about how we think about information across the value chain, because again, for those who would say the data are very confusing, we think there are areas for standardization, but there are also areas for alpha. There are areas where differentiation is important. So I find it easiest to think of it this way. The first area that needs information is from the company or the issuer to the investment analyst. And here we have groups like the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board and TCFD and so forth that are working on that. And so CFA Institute supports those efforts. We think that standardization is important. And the next phase from the analyst into the portfolio, that's where you have different ratings and indices and lots of different approaches that can work very well, that can enhance existing approaches. And so here we see our role in helping to educate investment professionals to use the skills they have in new and interesting ways to create value for their clients. And so we have, in addition to adding much more to the CFA program, the exam, we have also developed a new certificate. So our UK Society developed a certificate that is now available globally. Barbara, in fact, has gone through this program, so can tell you more about it. Meanwhile, the CFA program, the flagship exam we have, now about 16% of the readings in that have have ESG integrated in, and that's likely to go to about 20% as this develops further in the industry. And then lastly, we talked before about the need for standards in communication from the portfolio to the client. And so we think that transparency is extremely important, and we're working on that effort. So there's a little more information about the certificate. Barbara, I don't know if you want to talk about that now or see if there are questions. Happy to do that if you like. Do you want to say anything on that? No?
No.
Okay.
No.
Well, it's a self-study program that's about 130 hours of study. There are no formal entry requirements, and it's meant for both investment professionals and those who are client-facing. So I would encourage you to consider it. It's been very popular just in its first year here. And lastly, I'll just point you to some other resources that we have. So that rubric I described, the self-assessment, you can access it here. It would take probably less than 5 minutes to go through those questions. And then once you complete it, it will give you a list of resources. So things you could answer in, you could read a quick article for just a few minutes, or you could do something as extensive as that certificate. So with that, I will conclude the remarks and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And if there are any questions, some questions have been sent directly to me. And I have here a question on the taxonomy you mentioned. If you can please share a little bit more about that, because it's in Spanish, I'm translating.
Yeah.
When companies are rated on ESG basis, different rating systems rate very differently. So the question is if this taxonomy will help towards that, and if you can share a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah, the taxonomy is a big issue. And of course, the EU is leading the way in a lot of this, and I think will impact the way analysis is really done globally. So there are still a lot of unanswered questions about how that gets implemented specifically, but I think the industry is very eager to have a common language to describe all of this. And so there are a couple things I would note. First, those approaches we talked about, I think there is more there's more agreement now about how we discuss these things, whether it's exclusionary screening for taking out some companies in particular that don't align with your mission or your values, or whether it's ESG integration. That's one form of definitions that I think a lot of progress is being made on, and hopefully our standard will help with that as well. But again, it's those different parts in the chain that you have to think about. Where at the beginning and at the end, we need to do a lot more to make it effective.
And another question as to company disclosure, if it will become like mandatory that all companies disclose on various ESG standards?
Well, I think there's a difference, of course, between what is regulated and what is essentially required by the industry and investors. And so I would say that both are moving along in terms of investor demand and regulatory interest. So I don't know if I can say it will be mandatory, but I think there are many companies that are looking at who could their investor base be, and more, as you see from the figures we've shown, investors want to know if you're acting sustainably, and they're asking questions. And so I don't think this is an area that will slow down. It will only accelerate further.
And now I have a question for you. Future Finance has done reports on the most important, pressing, and applicable topics. What is the future report, the next report you're working on? What's the next topic that will be top on the agenda?
Yeah, well, so the next topic we are working on is the future of work in investment management. And so I know we've all had our work disrupted in the last year or months and so forth. And that has given us an opportunity to think about how work can be done most effectively. How do we prioritize what we do? And so we're going to be looking at not only where work gets done, as we anticipate probably more of a hybrid model in many places, but what types of work get done and how do we do it? How does this impact the investment culture, the firm at investment, the culture at investment organizations. So organizational culture is the third area. So we've been surveying our members on this, and we'll be excited to share more about that in the next month or so.
There are no further questions. So Rebecca, thank you so much for your time, and thanks everybody for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.